What's going on, guys? On today's episode of Ralph's Real Review, I'm going to be talking about race and the retelling of history by the dominant culture on the internet and not offend a single person. What could go wrong? If you haven't yet, please subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so you can be notified every time we post. But for now, let's get into the review. Pocahontas retells the story of Pocahontas, the daughter of a chief, not a princess, who wants to choose her own path as white settlers come to Virginia to look for gold. John Smith has a reputation as a well-known Indian killer, but his mind is changed when he meets Pocahontas and they start to fall in love as they learn to understand each other. The question in this movie is, can love stop war? And it turns out the answer is yes, as long as trees can talk and the wind can work as a translator. Animation-wise, I did feel like this movie took a step back, truthfully. It wasn't quite as clunky with the CGI as The Rescuers Down Under, but it also didn't stand out in its time like Sleeping Beauty did in its time. And I think for that reason, I have to put it at 6th. There were some beautiful shots in this movie that I think, they matter more for the storytelling department than for the animation department. So let's get to that because we have a lot to discuss in the storytelling department. I know I made light of it at the beginning of the video, but there is a lot to discuss with this storytelling ranking, and I do believe that it is a very serious conversation. I will start by stating who I am. I am a Puerto Rican man, which if you know anything about Puerto Rico, you understand we're kind of a hodgepodge of all different types of ethnicities and backgrounds. With that said, I have never identified with my indigenous background, so I won't pretend to now for the sake of this review. I am not ingratiated into the culture, and honestly, I don't know if there's like a difference between the different tribes feeling different types of ways about this subject or not. All I know is what I can tell you based off of a couple of hours of research and trying to present it in a way that is entertaining and intellectually engaging. With that disclaimer, off we go. This is the first Disney movie to be made based off a historical figure as opposed to just a fairy tale. However, you got talking trees, the wind allowing Pocahontas to speak English. If that doesn't give it away, this was not the real story of Pocahontas. In fact, most of this story is completely fictional, starting with the fact that Pocahontas' name in real life wasn't even Pocahontas. That was a nickname that was given to her as a child, and she looked nothing like how she does in the movie. In real life, she does marry Kocoum. She doesn't in the movie. She does marry a man named John Rolfe, not John Smith, after Kocoum is killed and she is kidnapped. John Smith was a real person, but it appears he may have embellished his story with Pocahontas, or at the very least, he told it from a very, very different perspective. Pocahontas was around 12 years old when she was in the vicinity of John Smith, and she may not have even saved him from death as the movie portrays, but rather took part in a ritual that John Smith simply may not have understood. So I'm giving you a rough version of what happened. Please feel free to do your own research to get a deeper understanding of the true story of Pocahontas. But my whole point here, however, is that what we see on film is not what happened in real life. How is Pocahontas second in storytelling right behind The Lion King? Allow me to explain. Opposition to Pocahontas is largely based on the fact that it is presented as a whitewashed version of history, a version in which Pocahontas is a good Indian for loving white culture and assimilating into Christianity. Her story is told through the lens of colonizers and settlers in a way that promotes themselves, and the indigenous people have every right to take issue with that. I personally take issue with that retelling of the story. The story of Pocahontas as a historical figure, traditionally speaking, is essentially a whitewashed look at U.S. propaganda that eliminates the bad and embellishes the good. Notice how I said the story and the legend of Pocahontas and not Disney's story of Pocahontas. These issues existed in the retelling of the story ever since John Smith told the story. However, Disney's retelling obviously brought this version of the story to the mainstream, so therefore Disney is complicit in perpetuating the lies, right? I disagree. For starters, Disney did not claim for this to be the telling of the true story of Pocahontas. Like I said in the opening, there are talking trees and wind translators. I also watched about 5 or 6 trailers from 1995, and nowhere did I hear them say anything about based on a true story. In fact, I did hear them say that they are telling the story, quote, of an American legend. Legends are not accurate by definition. By definition, they are considered historical, but not authenticated, which translates essentially to a loose tale, which is what this movie is. It's the telling of a story. Now, you may be saying, yeah, but the story Disney is telling is a terrible story to tell. And at a surface level, I agree. If Disney told the story as it's been told prior, they would be pretty wrong for that. However, they do go out of their way to display who is on the wrong side of history, while also telling a story not about a good Indian who loves white culture and Christianity, but about how fear and hate leads to death, while love and understanding leads to peace. This is about to be a whole video essay. Let's start with what I was alluding to in the animation section and then move toward the reason why I have this movie so high in storytelling, which is the writing, right? Animation-wise, we get some visual cues as to who is in the wrong as we see the settlers from the beginning boarding the ship. We also get a visual of a rat scurrying on board as well, symbolizing the dirtiness and untrustworthiness of those who are on board. You can choose if you take that to mean the entire boat or just the governor, as he is the one boarding when the rat comes on screen, but that's your call. We also get the visual of Pocahontas looking as the river splits between a calm path and a rougher path, which she chooses. And that is the essence of why this movie is different than the legend and isn't appreciated in that regard. This is the first real empowerment of the Disney princess, so to speak, right? We've seen it coming over time. Ariel does save Eric, but also I feel like things were happening to Ariel and she was just kind of responding. And ultimately her goal was to be kissed. We can't ignore that, right? Belle was a prisoner and she was a bookworm for sure, but her name translates to beauty. She is the beauty in Beauty and the Beast. And her role in the movie is only to have the Beast fall in love with her and for her to fall in love with the Beast. Jasmine is Pocahontas before Pocahontas, but that movie is not called Aladdin and Jasmine. It is called Aladdin, right? It is not her movie. Pocahontas is a woman who chooses. Pocahontas defies and leads her own path. The movie does not present her as someone who needs to learn from white culture and John Smith. In fact, it does the exact opposite and tells a story of how a bunch of bigots from England came to Virginia and need to learn from her. They have lines throughout the movie that show how the settlers were wrong.
The Indians, Williams, why do you think those insolent heathens attacked us?
Because we invaded their land and cut down their trees and dug up their earth.
I think the only misstep in this story was making their dynamic a love story. I think they did that for a couple of reasons. First, to sell the drama of a love triangle. Second, however, I think it's to speak to the larger message of the movie, which is that not knowing the other leads to fear, and often fear leads to hate and violence. Just ask Yoda, right? John Smith was going to shoot Pocahontas, right? Once he spoke to her and learned from her, he no longer wanted to kill, he wanted to learn. Through her love for him, she was able to stop her father from killing him and prevented a war that realistically would have decimated her people. I think they could have made that point with a platonic love. It didn't have to be a romantic love, but Disney was having success with the love formula, so love. Third was to have some semblance of John Smith's real-life retelling of the story, but besides that, this is a totally different point of view than what the original legend was, which was a totally different point of view from what actually happened. The next point that typically comes up is, well, they should have just told the true story, which, okay. So let's follow that thought all the way through to conclusion. Disney, which is a family company and has branded itself that way throughout their history, well, maybe not throughout all of it, but you know what I'm saying. They make a movie about a 12-year-old girl who is sexualized by settlers. She has her husband murdered and then is kidnapped and held hostage for a year before being taken to England and becoming a legend as a betrayer of her people. That's the movie you wanted Disney to make. I don't think that would have went over very well. So then the next point is, well, maybe we shouldn't make the movie at all. Fair point. But that begs the question, is the world a better place without this Disney retelling of Pocahontas? I would argue no. First, we have our first minority woman, or our first woman of color as a lead in a Disney movie. And what an introduction, right? This character of Pocahontas is an icon that inspired so many heroines that came after in the Disney company, but I'll touch on that in the character section. She takes complete control of her own life and her own way. She teaches, right? I'm not even going to get into what she teaches the colonists or what she teaches her own father and her own tribe in the movie, but she teaches us. Her songs, which I will touch on in the music section, are so lyrically rich with lessons of temperance and understanding. It's honestly incredible and something we haven't seen. This version of the character is an incredible role model, not just for women, but for everybody. I've spent way too long on this section, so I'm going to kind of wrap it up here. I think it was necessary to have a real intellectual conversation about this and where this movie stands. I think the writing is fantastic. I think the decision to make this movie was bold, and the choices they made in recreating and retelling the legend were mostly admirable. I do have Pocahontas at 2 in terms of storytelling. When it comes to characters, I had Pocahontas as high as 4th at one point and as low as 9th before I finally settled on 6th place for this movie. I would argue at this point in time, Pocahontas is our strongest protagonist in Disney history again, as of 1995. The roster behind her, though, is mediocre at best. I would say the next strongest character maybe is like a Grandmother Willow. Nothing in comparison to those like Mufasa or Genie or Tinkerbell. Their villain is also kind of weak in comparison, so I'm taking the strength of Pocahontas alone and showing her respect over the roster of like a movie like Winnie the Pooh due to what she will inspire moving forward. But I gotta take the overall rosters into consideration past that point when we talk about, having like a Peter Pan, Tinkerbell, and Captain Hook in one movie, just to name a few. For the Disney factor, I have Pocahontas at 9th, and for the sake of saving time, I'm going to redirect you to the 10 minutes or so I just spent on the storytelling section. It has incredible music, it has a historical retelling, it deals with some real life issues, someone is shot in the movie, 9th place. When it comes to music, I'm going to put Pocahontas at 4th ahead of The Little Mermaid, which feels crazy, I know, but I can't get over the lyrical depth of these songs. You have 2 songs that everyone knows, kinda, which would be Colors of the Wind and Around the River Bend, but you also have Savages, which I think is a severely underrated song and is such an epic accompaniment to the climax of the movie as well, being almost as lyrically piercing as the other songs I mentioned before. As for the other song in this movie, Mine, 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 I do think it is a weaker villain song, especially coming off of Be Prepared, Gaston, Poor Unfortunate Souls, but it still gets to the root of our villain's motivation, which is simply greed. I would rather listen to the Little Mermaid soundtrack over Pocahontas' soundtrack, there is no doubt about that, but this category can't be that simple. The lyrics are teachers and really display the wisdom and strength of our protagonist, so it's going to be in 4th place today. Box office section, not entirely fixed yet, but I can place Pocahontas securely at 13th place with a little under $479.6 million when adjusted for inflation. It's right between 2 classics, behind Cinderella and ahead of Sleeping Beauty. And for the interest of saving time, I'm going to roll directly into the historical significance section where I have Pocahontas at 7th place based solely on the fact that it's the 3rd time Disney is putting a person of color in the lead role. You had Mowgli and Aladdin, but it's the first time putting a woman of color in the lead position, and the influence she has had on Disney heroines as soon as Mulan, which would come out a couple of years later, and as far reaching as Elsa. You could say perhaps Jasmine continued or started to push the envelope for Disney princesses taking control of their own stories. Pocahontas stands alone in her own movie, and she gets the credit here. That brings us to the tiers, which I actually might spend a little bit of time on today due to everything I said earlier. The soundtrack alone eliminates the bottom 2 tiers, right? It automatically puts it in the Disney fans category. I do think the movie does enough to push itself up to the movie fans category. I think the animation is good enough, the writing is good enough. While the plot is a bit generic, I think the messaging is strong. The reason why I am going to push it into the everybody should see category or the everyone should see category is because of what I said in the storytelling section. This is a movie that promotes dialogue and discussion. There's many reasons why we go to the movies. We can go to escape, we can go to feel, but sometimes we can go to learn. And no matter where you stand on the discussion about this movie does promote discussion, which I love. I think everyone should see this movie to form an opinion and engage in dialogue about bigger issues. I think everyone should watch this movie to learn about the acceptance of, or at least the tolerance of, the other, right? Most important, I think everyone should watch this movie because it is a good movie. That's going to do it for today's episode, guys. If you haven't yet, please subscribe and help join our community, help grow our community. I'm trying to get to 500 subs on YouTube by the end of 2025. We're already halfway through February, so if you're enjoying this content, definitely subscribe to the channel, share it with your friends, hit the bell so that you can be notified whenever I post a new review, like I will be doing this week with Captain America: Brave New World. I would say maybe our first big blockbuster of the year. If you haven't seen my Love Hurts review, you can check it out here as well. I'll link it up top. I'm also trying to reach 1,000 followers on TikTok by the end of 2025. So you can follow me there at Ralph's Rapid Review, where I post essentially the 1-minute bite-sized versions of these. Go into the comments, guys. Tell me, what do you think about Pocahontas? All right, I would love to have a great civil discussion about Pocahontas. That would be awesome. But shout out to Mr. Pope and Mr. Valentine. I remember, back in 8th grade, that was the first time I had to kind of dissect a movie like this, and we watched Pocahontas and talked about the historical inaccuracies. That was in Mr. Pope's class, and then I had a class called History Through the Media with Mr. Mark Valentine, and he promoted us to kind of do the same thing. It wasn't Disney. We went over like Gladiator and Cinderella Man and movies like that. But I think that those classes and those lessons kind of led me to enjoy movies the way that I enjoy movies today. So shout out to you guys. Shout out to teachers everywhere out there. Thank you so much for watching. That'll do it. Thanks, guys. Bye.